Today, I'm going to talk about the second part of why you can't learn a language. There are a few things we're going to focus on today. So I mainly want to focus on motivation, on learning vocabulary, and on immersion. One of the biggest things I think people don't realize is when they're learning a second language, motivation is a huge factor in whether or not you're successful. And in my experience, a lot of students who learn English, especially in China, they don't have a lot of intrinsic motivation, which means they don't have a lot of motivation from within themselves. The motivation instead comes from things like getting a good grade, finding a good job, getting into a good school. Those are all forms of extrinsic motivation. And extrinsic motivation is the motivation that you get from others. And while that motivation can be helpful, it's not as good as you being motivated to do it yourself. So if you're learning a language because you want to improve who you are, you want to learn a new skill that benefits you in your life, that's more likely going to help you in the long run for learning a language rather than just trying to learn because somebody else told you to. I feel like part of the problem too when learning a language is most of the time you take a class, and if you take a class you have grades, and grades often function as a motivator, but they're not really good at motivating. So, for example, I teach students, and some of my assignments have no grade on them, but I do give feedback on the assignments. And the feedback is useful for future assignments that has grades. I found that doing that, the feedback alone can help students be motivated. The problem is if you only use grades as a motivator, a lot of times students are only going to try to get a good grade. They don't care if they learn. So there are students sometimes in classes that will use AI. And while AI use isn't bad in and of itself, if you use AI to finish work when you're trying to learn a language, of course you're not going to learn the language because AI is doing the work for you. And that's a big thing, is you want to make sure that if you're learning the language, you are the reason why you're learning it. You chose it because you want to do it. You're interested in it. Or something like maybe you're interested in another country's culture, and you want to go there and live there. Well, then that's a really good motivator. I think the other area that students struggle with is with learning vocabulary. And vocabulary is one of the major factors in whether or not you're going to be able to speak or understand what's being spoken to you. I think, at least in my own research, and when I'm teaching, I found that there are 3 things that are related to this. I use the words relevance, repetition, and rate. So relevance is the vocabulary you're learning related or relevant to your life? So if you're learning vocabulary and it has nothing to do with anything you care about, you're probably not going to remember the vocabulary very well. This is why when I teach, I try to get students to choose topics they want to learn about. So, for example, if we're doing a class on American culture and we're going to talk about the government, I might give a list of topics that students could explore about the government that's connected to things they enjoy. It's not as hard as it sounds. For example, let's say a student really likes sports and they really like basketball. There are things that you could look into, perhaps pertaining to maybe they have certain policies that affect immigration, and maybe there is a famous basketball player who's an immigrant. But I don't know. I don't watch basketball. But my point is you can have students connect their interests to their learning. And as a student, you can try to connect your interest to your learning because that's going to make you learn so much better. The other thing, repetition, I think people misunderstand what repetition means. Repetition does not mean just over and over and over again using the word or seeing the word. What repetition means is the word that you're learning, you encounter it multiple times in different contexts, and you understand the use of the word when it's being used in those contexts. Which is a form of repetition, but it's not just like, mindless repeating. There's a purpose for it. Another thing too is if you are going to use repetition, so for example, like if you have flashcards, you need to space out You have to have spaced repetition. It's kind of like you work out and then you give your body time to rest and then you go and work out again later. You don't just work out all day. Let's say I want to get buff. I'm not going to work out for an entire 24 hours. I'm going to have to work out for a little bit and then rest and then wait until after the rest and then work out again. It's the same thing with learning. So when you're learning words, you need to have spaced repetition. The other thing is rate. The amount of times or the frequency that you do it will affect how well you learn it. Let's say I'm trying to memorize 50 words. Personally, what I would do is I would break those words down into chunks. So instead of doing 50 all at once, I would do 10 at a time. Let's say I'm learning Chinese words. I would have the Chinese words on one side of the card and the English word on the other side of the card. Because my mother tongue is English, it's easier for me to translate from Chinese to English. So I would look at the Chinese word first and try to recall or remember the English word. And then I would flip the card over to see if I was correct. I would do that for each of the 10 words. And then I would wait. I would rest. I would go do something else. So doing that with 10 words would probably only take a few minutes. Then you go and, go for a brief walk, a 15-minute walk, or listen to music or something, and then come back and then do it again. So I would do the 10 words, do 10 words like twice, and then start adding in more words, add in 5 more words, or add in 10 more words, and do that and just keep going with it. Another thing you can do is you want to make sure that you are being exposed to the word more than once. So certain things will do that. So for example, stories often repeat key words multiple times. And stories can be from like TV shows, movies, even music can be stories sometimes. Video games can be stories. You can make your own story. So if you write a story and you use English, you can have a list of words that you want to memorize and you can use those words in your story. One of the hard things is if the words are really obscure or they're not connected or related to each other, then it might be difficult for you to write the story. But if you can tie them in, I promise you, you will remember them a lot easier because you actually used them and you created meaning with them. The last thing I want to talk about is immersion. I think a lot of people believe that if you immerse yourself in a language, you will learn it fluently, like a native speaker. That isn't really true. Personally, I know a lot of foreigners who've lived in China. They've lived in China for 7 to 10 years. They've been taking Chinese lessons, on a weekly basis for many years, and they are not fluent at all. But they live and work in China. Their coworkers are Chinese. The problem is immersion is only effective if you understand most of what's going on. The reason why children learn language so easily is because adults talk down to their level. Most adults don't just go to a child and start talking about physics. And if they do talk about physics with children, they break it down and simplify it so they understand it. If you're trying to learn a language, that means you want to be involved with other people who can do that for you. So one of the reasons why people take classes is because teachers can do that. Teachers know how to break things down, how to simplify them. Regular people might not be good at that. So in my experience, when learning Chinese, there have been a few times I ask my friends to explain certain concepts. They're really bad at it. Like, there's this thing people do in Chinese. It's so frustrating. If you ask for a word and you say, let's say they use a word like shui. Shui means water. But let's say they say the word shui and you don't know what shui means. So you say, what does shui mean? They will say shui 就是水, which means water is water. They're not really explaining anything. They're just repeating the word and you're still like, I don't know what that means. Whereas a teacher would be better at saying like, oh, shui is a liquid. You can drink it. It's clear. You can use it to cook. You shower with it. You brush your teeth with it. When you go swimming, you swim in shui. Like, they will use examples to help you understand the concepts. You can find groups that do this. Sometimes friends will do this, especially if your friends know that you're learning a language. They're usually pretty good, but it depends on the friend group. You have to ask, The other thing is total immersion isn't that great of a thing. So in research, of course, this has been researched for a long time. If immersion was so effective, like if it was truly the most effective way to learn a language, there would be no question in research about it anymore. People would stop studying it, but they haven't stopped because when we compare people, so students who go abroad to learn a language and students who stay home, like in their home country to learn the language, those groups are compared. Research shows that the students who go abroad, they do improve in speaking and in listening. but other skills do not improve, and sometimes other skills get worse. Whereas students who stay home, they usually have more growth with vocabulary, they have more growth with grammar understanding, they might have more growth with writing skills. If immersion was the most effective thing, we wouldn't need to do these comparisons anymore, which means it's not as effective as people think. And there are times where students go abroad and they never get fluent, because what happens is they stick to their friend group instead of going out and meeting new people. So if you want to immerse, you have to do it in the correct way. And that doesn't mean just completely being in the language. It means being in the language that's relevant to you, that you can understand, that you can be exposed to on a regular basis. So one thing I do in my class is called translanguaging. That's where I actually require students to use Chinese in class with me. The reason why is because oftentimes students will learn phrases in English and they learn them one way and they don't realize the phrase means more than one thing. And they might use the phrase to respond to something, but that it completely changes the meaning they intended to say. And so if I hear that, I can normally tell. I will ask them to say it in Chinese, and then I find out, oh, this is not what you meant. By doing that, that also means now I've helped correct the error because somebody taught them wrong or they learned it wrong. And then two, it also means if a student does not know what to say or how to say something, I can help because I understand their Chinese. But I also do this in my own language learning. If I come across a word that I don't know how to say and I'm communicating with somebody who speaks my language as well, I will use English. For example, in Chinese, like if I didn't know the word shui, which I said earlier, water, right? If I don't know the word water and I want to say I want to drink water, I might just say 我要喝 water. I would just do that. The person understands me, and if they want to help, they might tell me, oh, we say shui for water. Okay, now I've learned a word. But if they don't help me, I'm still able to communicate. Because what I've noticed is students who don't translanguage and who only use one, like the one language they're learning, so in my case, my students are learning English, when students do that, they get stuck and they don't talk at all. They say nothing. Well, if you say nothing, you can't practice your speaking skills, which means now you're not learning anything at all. But if you use translanguaging, now you can actually practice your skills. Even if you're at home, let's say you're practicing and you want to just speak out loud to yourself. Use your mother tongue and English together. Use Chinese and English together. Use Spanish and English together. Use 3 languages if you want. It doesn't matter. The point is you're trying to practice. You're practicing, there's a few things. You're practicing your muscle skills, which you do need for pronunciation. You're also practicing your brain's ability to produce the muscle movements you need, because you have to use certain pathways in the brain. It's beneficial to your learning to do that. The same thing when you're talking to classmates. Many students will do this, and I prefer it. So if sometimes we have discussions in class, they're called Socratic seminars. We do Socratic seminars in class, and students, if they can speak Chinese, are way more involved in the discussion, which means they learn more because they're involved. But if they just want to speak in English, usually the discussion is very boring, and students don't really discuss. They just say their opinion and then stop talking. But a discussion should be a mixture of people exchanging ideas, disagreeing and then coming to a conclusion together. That's what we want. If you want to learn a second language, you need to make sure that it's relevant to your life, that you're able to repeat the, learning words, you're able to expose yourself, but that you can do it at a rate that's useful for you. So don't just do all day, the entire day. Don't just do 10 minutes a day. That's not going to do much. You need to do over, the course of the day, do a few minutes here and there. And you need to make sure that whatever environment you're in, you are able to practice your skills. So if someone tells you you have to use all English and you cannot practice your skills, that's not a good environment for you. Just like if you're learning English and somebody tells you to only use Chinese to practice English, of course you're not going to learn any English, or you're not going to learn it that well because you can't practice it. You want to have the middle ground. We call it the happy medium. Thanks for watching. I hope this video is helpful for your language learning.